The war ended, but the real horror was just beginning. When the Vethi surrendered, they didn't offer peace, they offered people. One human soldier, one alien woman. But when Rennick Vale received his claim slip, he found 3 women waiting, and they spoke words that would change everything. "We are not 3. We are 1. Sarnak 9 lay broken under a bruised sky. 23 years of energy fire and orbital bombardment had scoured the atmosphere. What remained were skeletal buildings, glass craters, and the lingering smell of ozone and death. Humanity won this war, but victory tasted like ash and cold metal. The treaty terms settled like a slow poison in the system. For every human soldier, 1 Vethi woman was offered, not as prisoners, not as refugees, as prizes. The Vethi called it the Samaya, the binding. Human command called it reparation. In practice, it meant standing in line with a claim slip to receive a living person. Women whose husbands and brothers had died in the same conflict became property. Daughters separated from mothers, sisters from siblings, all entered into a database of exchange. The system viewed them as assets to be logged and distributed. It ignored their histories, their grief, their humanity. Rennick Vale was a logistics officer. He moved crates, tracked supply lines, and avoided frontline combat through a mix of caution and sheer luck. His service record was long, not glorious. It listed efficiency ratings and inventory audits, not valor citations. When his name came up in the lottery, it felt like a mistake. Or a punishment. The slip of paper in his hand was thin, official. It bore his name, service number, and the words, 1 Vethi female non-combatant status. It should have felt like a reward. It felt like a sentence. He walked toward what remained of the command tent. Canvas flapped in the dry wind. Officers moved with exhausted purpose, shuffling data pads and avoiding each other's eyes. Rennick's boots crunched on blackened soil. He remembered the faces of friends lost over the years. Their absence was a weight he carried quietly. This transaction, this claiming of a person, made that weight shift into something colder. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who organized rations and fuel. This moment, this walk, was pushing him into a role he never wanted. Duty had always meant following orders. Now it asked him to accept a person as property. He neared the processing area. A row of temporary shelters stood behind a cordon. Inside one, he would find the woman whose life was now tied to his service number. The air felt thick. His chest tightened. This was not anticipation. It was dread. He was about to meet the cost of a victory that felt more like loss. His understanding of duty, of what it meant to be human in a universe that traded lives, was about to fracture. Rennick stepped into the dimly lit shelter, expecting one solitary figure. Instead, he saw 3 women standing close together. Their forms were silhouetted against the canvas wall. They did not look frightened. They did not look defeated. They stood with a stillness that felt deeper than human patience. It was a quiet that seemed to absorb the noise of the camp outside. The processing officer gave a tired shrug. "Says here you get one. Says here there are 3. Paperwork glitch. Your problem now, Lieutenant." He walked away, leaving Rennick alone with them. The air in the tent felt different, colder, clearer. The tallest one stepped forward slightly. Her skin held a faint silver sheen, like moonlight on water. "I am Silra." The one to her left, with eyes the color of deep moss, nodded. "I am Liss." The third, whose hands were traced with faint, glowing lines, completed it. "I am Maria." They spoke not in turns, but as if the words came from a single source. Their voices wove together. There was no hesitation, no overlap. Rennick's training kicked in. This was a violation of the surrender terms, a direct breach of protocol. He started to form a question, to demand an explanation he knew the officers outside wouldn't have. But Silra spoke again, and her voice carried a weight that stopped his words. "We are not 3. We are 1. The statement hung in the air. It defied logic. It defied the reality of 3 separate bodies standing before him. Yet the way they held themselves, the slight mirrored tilt of their heads, made it feel less like a claim and more like a fact. Liss continued, her voice softer but no less certain. "We are bound by blood." Maria's hands lifted slightly, the light on her skin pulsing. "By vow," Silra finished, her tone final. "By the last song of our elders." They fell silent, a perfect unified pause. This was no mere friendship. It wasn't sisterhood or loyalty born of shared hardship. This was something woven into their very being. "Rennick," a man who dealt in quantifiable supplies and concrete data, felt the ground of his understanding shift. They were telling him their connection was metaphysical, a thing of spirit and energy, not just flesh. They explained that this covenant was ancient. It was a shield, a protection maintained through ritual and shared consciousness. To separate them would be to break a chain that had held for generations. The consequences of that break were not just personal. They implied, cosmic. The military saw individuals, a unit of one. They were asking him to see a single entity in three parts, a harmony that could not be taken apart without destroying the music itself. Rennick looked from one face to another. He saw the same calm certainty in each set of eyes. They were not pleading. They were informing. They had accepted their fate was now tied to his decision. Their unity was a fact they lived, a truth they embodied. His human frameworks of thought strained against it. 1 + 1 + 1 did not equal 1, but standing there in the quiet of the tent, he began to feel that their math might be the one that mattered. Rennick listened. The three women stood before him, their presence a quiet argument against the war's logic. They explained their bond was not a choice. It was a biological and spiritual imperative, passed down like a genetic memory. Their ancestors, generations back, had witnessed something. A tear in the fabric of space, a glimpse of what waited in the void. In answer, the elders of their people crafted a covenant. It was a vow written not on paper but in blood and song and shared thought. It was a shield against a threat human science had no name for. The vow provided a specific kind of protection. It generated a harmonic resonance, a frequency that acted as a barrier. This resonance was a product of their unified consciousness. When they sang their rituals, when they shared their thoughts, they were not just communicating. They were tuning reality itself. They were reinforcing a wall against forces that fed on dissonance and despair. The bond was the source of the power. It was the engine. Breaking it would not just cause emotional pain. It would sever the connection instantly. The protection would vanish like a snuffed candle. This knowledge was ancient. It had been preserved through oral histories, through ritualistic songs taught to each new generation of bonded trios. It was a sacred duty more important than any single life. Their culture was built around this understanding. Their society valued unity over individuality because their survival depended on it. They were living relics of a wisdom humanity had never encountered. Human military protocols were built on quantifiable data. They could account for enemy ships, energy signatures, and planetary defenses. They had no category for a metaphysical shield maintained by emotional and spiritual harmony. A logistics officer's manual contained procedures for allocating rations, ammunition, and personnel. It had no chapter on handling a bonded triad that claimed to be a single cosmic security system. Rennick's training told him to report the anomaly. To follow the clear written rule, 1 soldier, 1 prize. The treaty was explicit. His orders were simple. He faced a choice that felt larger than himself. On one side stood the entire weight of military command, the rule of law as his people understood it. It was clear, clean, and disobeying it meant court-martial. On the other side stood these three women in their silent, certain truth. They spoke of an ancient vow, of a protection that spanned generations. They asked him to believe in something he could not measure or see. To choose them was to choose faith over fact. It was to value an ancient promise over a modern protocol. He looked at their calm faces. He felt the strange stillness that surrounded them. The choice was no longer about following orders. It was about what he was willing to break. A regulation or a covenant that might be holding back the dark. Silra spoke the truth of it. The Watchers were not a species or a civilization. They were a phenomenon. Entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions, in the silent gaps of reality. They were not flesh or machine. They were manifestations of pure entropy, drawn to places where order broke down. Their presence was not an invasion. It was an infection. They fed on despair, on broken promises, on the collapse of sacred bonds. A fractured vow was a feast for them, a beacon. They became active when harmony disintegrated, when a culture lost its unity, when a family splintered, when trust turned to dust. The veil between their dimension and ours grew thin. It was like a membrane stretched too tight, a song that lost its key. The discord created a weakness they could exploit. They didn't cross over with ships or weapons. They seeped through. Their arrival was often silent, unnoticed at first. A creeping sense of wrongness, a shadow that moved just outside your vision. Their presence brought madness. It started with whispers in the mind, thoughts that were not your own. They magnified fear. They twisted memory. They made allies suspect each other. They turned love into paranoia. Entire civilizations had fallen not to war but to this internal rot. The Watchers didn't need to fight. They simply watched as societies turned on themselves, consuming the emotional chaos until nothing remained but silence and dust. Their endgame was not conquest. It was annihilation. The complete unraveling of a world spirit. The trio's bond was the antidote. Their unified consciousness generated a harmonic frequency, a constant low hum of order. It was a song of connection. This resonance pushed against the chaotic energy of the Watchers. It reinforced the veil. It kept the membrane strong. Their vow was the source of the song. Breaking their bond would be like snapping the string on a violin in the middle of a symphony. The silence that followed would be a scream in the dark, echoing across dimensions. A broken oath would act as a psychic beacon. It would shine like a cold star, visible only to the Watchers. It would signal a feast, a place where the fabric of reality was weak and ripe for tearing. It would draw them in numbers, hungry and focused. Human military strategy had no contingency for this. There were no protocols for metaphysical entities that fed on emotional despair. Battle plans accounted for enemy fleets, ground troops, and orbital bombardments. They did not account for an enemy you could not shoot, that turned your own fear against you. Command would see 3 women. A logistical error, a breach of treaty. They would not see the fragile dam holding back a flood of cosmic horror. Rennick understood the scale now. This was not a local problem. It was not about one officer breaking a rule. The threat was immediate. It was happening right now in this tent. His next decision could either maintain a shield that protected realities or shatter it and invite an enemy beyond human comprehension. The war he knew was over. A much older, much darker conflict was waiting just beyond the light. Rennick stood in the tent, the claim slip a cold weight in his palm. His military training was a clear, loud voice in his mind. It told him to turn around, to find the nearest officer and report the irregularity. Protocol was unambiguous. The treaty stated 1 Vethi individual per human soldier. This was not a negotiation. It was a directive. Following orders had kept him alive for 23 years. It was the bedrock of his service. He knew the procedure. Identify the problem. Escalate to command. Wait for instructions. The system was designed to handle deviations, to correct errors with bureaucratic efficiency. He looked at the 3 women. The processing officer had left them in his custody, a problem to be solved. The rule said he must choose one. He must point to Silra or Liz or Maria and accept her as his property. The other 2 would be taken back. Their fate would be reassigned, logged into the system, given to another soldier. The act felt grotesque. It was like being asked to choose which limb to cut from a living body. Their bond was not a simple connection. It was an organism in itself, a thing of energy and will that required all 3 parts to exist. To break them apart was not separation, it was dissection. Something in their stillness reached him. It was not the calm of resignation. It was the quiet of deep certainty. They knew their truth. They had explained the stakes with a clarity that bypassed his training and spoke to something older. His own experience rose to meet it. He had survived not because he was the best soldier, but because he sometimes trusted a gut feeling over a regulation, a flicker of movement in a shadow, a silence that felt wrong. Those instincts had pulled him out of ambushes, made him check a fuel line twice, saved his life when logic said he was safe. This feeling was the same. The Watchers were not a theory to them. They were a reality. Their warning carried the weight of lived truth. Military doctrine felt abstract by comparison. A set of rules written by men who had never imagined a threat that could not be shot. His duty, as he had always understood it, was to follow orders to protect humanity. But what was protection now? Was it enforcing a treaty clause written in ignorance? Or was it listening to a warning about an enemy that could end worlds? The 3 women before him were not just survivors. They were guardians. They held a line against a darkness his people did not even know existed. To break their bond would be to vandalize a monument he didn't understand, just because the rules said he could. He made the decision quietly. There was no dramatic moment. He simply folded the claim slip and put it in his pocket. He would not report them. He would not choose one. He would take all 3. He would defy a direct order and risk his career, his freedom, everything he had. The choice redefined duty for him. Protection was not blind obedience. It was sometimes the courage to disobey. It was recognizing that some rules were too small for the realities they tried to contain. He looked at them, this impossible trio, and gave a single, slow nod. It was an answer. It was a promise. He would protect them all. The military dropship shuddered as it lifted from the scarred surface of Zarnak 9. The cargo hold was packed with soldiers, their armor still smudged with ash and dried mud. The air smelled of sweat, ozone, and the sharp tang of recycled oxygen. Rennick sat with the three Vethi women, their presence an island of quiet in the tense space. The other soldiers watched them. Their stares were not curious. They were hard, suspicious. The war had just ended, but the distrust ran deep. An alien was an alien. 3 aliens were a threat. A corporal with a fresh scar across his cheek kept his hand near his sidearm. His eyes fixed on Silra. He muttered something to the soldier next to him. The words were low, but the hostility in them was clear. It was a common sentiment. These women were prizes, trophies from a defeated enemy. They did not belong in the shared space of victors. They were a reminder of a conflict that had cost too much. The energy in the cabin was a coiled spring. Anxiety, anger, fatigue. It was a volatile mix, pressurized by the cramped quarters and the memory of loss. Then the ship hit the transition point into faster-than-light travel. The engines whined to a higher pitch. The interior lights flickered, a common occurrence that usually ratcheted up the tension another notch. Soldiers gripped their harnesses tighter, jaws clenched. But then something shifted. The trio began to hum. It was not a song with words. It was a low, harmonic vibration, so soft it was almost felt more than heard. It seemed to come from all 3 of them at once, a single, unified sound that wove through the mechanical noise of the ship. At first it was just a background sensation, like the hum of the engines themselves. But it grew, not in volume, but in presence. The flickering overhead lights didn't just stabilize. They changed. The harsh white glare softened into a warm golden glow. It felt like the light from an old incandescent bulb, not a military ship's LED array. The light pulsed gently in time with their humming. A visible wave of something like heat haze shimmered along the metal walls of the cabin. It curled around support beams and air vents like delicate glowing vines. The air itself seemed to thicken, to become easier to breathe. The change in the soldiers was slow, then all at once. The corporal with the scar relaxed his grip on his weapon. His shoulders, which had been hunched up near his ears, dropped. The hard line of his mouth softened. The soldier next to him let out a long, slow breath he seemed to have been holding for years. He leaned his head back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. The suspicion in the air didn't just fade. It dissolved. It was washed away by the gentle, pervasive hum. The anxious energy uncoiled. The cabin was filled with a profound, shared calm. It was the quiet of a deep sleep, the peace of a safe place. Rennick watched it happen. He felt it himself. A tension he had carried for 2 decades, a constant low-grade alarm in his nerves, simply let go. He looked at the 3 women. Their eyes were closed. They were focused inward on the sound they created together. This was no trick. It was a demonstration. Their bond was not just a spiritual concept. It generated a tangible physical effect on the world around them. They could influence emotion, atmosphere, even technology through the harmonic resonance of their unity. They had told him their bond was a shield. On that trembling dropship, surrounded by calming soldiers and warm light, he saw it in action. It was a power that defied every conventional explanation his world had to offer. The dropship set down on Astrahaven with a final metallic groan. The airlock hissed open to reveal a sterile gray hangar bay. Commander Drake stood waiting. His posture was rigid, his expression carved from stone. His eyes scanned the disembarking soldiers, then fixed immediately on Rennick and the 3 Vethi women. He didn't need a report. He saw the problem. 1 human, 3 aliens. The math was simple. It was wrong. He motioned 2 armed guards forward. They flanked the trio, their presence an unspoken threat. Drake's gaze was cold, analytical. He saw a breach of protocol, a potential diplomatic incident. The Vethi surrender was fragile, built on precise negotiated terms. This deviation threatened to unravel it. In his world, rules were the foundation of order. This was chaos. He classified them not as people, but as high-risk assets. Their unusual bond was a variable he could not control. His solution was the only one his training allowed. Separation. Isolate them. Study them. Restore the treaty's balance. Rennick stepped forward, his own uniform feeling suddenly thin against Drake's authority. He tried to explain. He spoke of the ancient covenant of the Watchers that fed on broken bonds. His words sounded hollow and strange in the bright artificial light of the hangar. He described a cosmic threat, an enemy of despair. Drake listened, his face unmoved. He heard superstition. He heard the ramblings of a stressed officer who had spent too long in a war zone. "The treaty is explicit, Lieutenant," Drake said, his voice flat and final. "It says 1, not 2, not 3. The words were a wall. They left no room for ancient vows or harmonic resonance. Human law was built on words on a page, not songs in the blood. His priority was the stability of the peace, the maintenance of a system that had, however brutally, ended a 23-year war. This anomaly jeopardized that hard-won stability. The trio did not cower. Silra spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the military tension. "Your laws are young," she said. "They cannot contain what is older than your species, what runs deeper than policy." She looked from Drake to the nervous guards. They offered a demonstration, not a threat, a showing. They would perform a ritual song, a small part of their power. They would prove their unity was not a choice but a necessary force. Drake's jaw tightened. He saw this as a challenge to his authority, a parlor trick to avoid the consequences of a broken regulation, yet a flicker of cold curiosity showed in his eyes. He needed to understand this variable to neutralize it. He gave a sharp single nod. The hangar bay became an impromptu stage. The hum of machinery provided a dissonant backdrop. The armed guards remained, their weapons held ready. This was more than a test of power. It was a confrontation between two entirely different forms of authority. One was written in ink and enforced with weapons. The other was written in blood and sung into existence. The weight in the air shifted. It was no longer about a simple rule break. It was about whose understanding of reality would prove stronger. The hangar bay felt like a cage of tense air and hard light. Commander Drake stood with his arms crossed, a statue of military resolve. He gave a single sharp nod. It was not permission. It was a challenge. "Show me." The three women moved without hurry. They formed a tight triangle, their shoulders nearly touching. "Silra, Liz, Maria." They closed their eyes. For a moment, there was only the hum of the bay's ventilation system. Then they began to sing. It was not a song with words. It was a harmony that existed below language. Their voices blended into a single complex tone. It was a sound that felt both ancient and immediate. It didn't just fill the air. It changed the air. The quality of the light in the hangar shifted. The harsh white glare softened, taking on a golden, almost liquid quality. Visible waves of soft light pulsed out from the trio. They moved through the space like gentle ripples on a pond, washing over the gray walls, the polished floor, the people. The two guards flanking them were the first to change. Their grip on their weapons loosened. The tightness in their shoulders eased. One of them blinked slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep. The hard line of his mouth relaxed. He didn't lower his rifle. It simply became less important. The other guard let his weapon's barrel dip toward the floor. The aggressive tension in his posture melted away. The suspicion in their eyes was replaced by a calm, distant focus. They were still present, but the fight had gone out of them. The effect spread. Soldiers standing near the periphery of the bay began to relax. A man who had been clenching his jaw let out a long, slow breath. A woman who had been tapping her foot nervously against the deck plating went still. The ambient anxiety that defined a military installation simply dissolved. It was replaced by a profound shared stillness. It felt like the deep quiet of a forest after a snowfall. The urge for conflict, for aggression, for hostility was neutralized, not through force but through harmony. Commander Drake felt it too. His stern expression did not change by choice. It changed against his will. The rigid set of his shoulders softened. The critical, analyzing look in his eyes grew distant, then thoughtful. The song did not command him. It simply made the act of commanding feel unnecessary. It created a space where conflict was not just absent but impossible. The ritual did not last long. Perhaps a minute. When the three women fell silent, the harmony lingered in the air for a few more seconds, a fading echo of peace. The hangar bay returned to normal. The light hardened back to its usual white. The soldiers shook their heads slightly, coming back to themselves. But the mood had shifted irreversibly. The hostility was gone. The guards looked at their weapons as if surprised to be holding them. They took a step back from the trio. Drake remained silent for a long moment. He looked at the three women, then at Rennick, then at his own men. He had witnessed a power that his manuals and protocols could not explain. He had felt his own authority become irrelevant in the face of a deeper truth. The demonstration was over. It had proven their bond was not a metaphysical theory. It was a measurable, reality-altering force. He could no longer dismiss it as superstition. He had to reconsider everything. The confrontation in the hangar ended not with an order, but with a grim acceptance. Commander Drake conceded the immediate point. He granted them clearance to depart Astrahaven, but his authorization was thin, conditional. He provided no support, no official transport, no resources. His silence was a message. This was their problem, their risk. Their potential failure would be theirs alone. In a small private briefing room, the trio laid out the full scope of the crisis for Rennick. The urgency was not arbitrary. It was celestial. The 3 moons of their homeworld, Vethar Minor, were completing a slow, grand orbit. In exactly 17 standard days, they would achieve a perfect syzygy. A direct linear alignment. This was not just an astronomical event. It was a metaphysical one. The alignment exerted a tidal force not on oceans, but on reality itself. It thinned the veil between dimensions. It weakened the walls that kept certain things out. This 17-day window was a door. It was the only time the Watchers could cross over fully into our reality. Before this, their influence was limited. They could whisper. They could infect minds from the edges. But during the alignment, they could step through. They could manifest in solid, horrific forms. They could bring their full annihilating presence to bear. The trio's bond was a shield, but it was a localized one. It kept the Watchers at bay in their immediate vicinity. It was not enough to seal the rip that the alignment would create across an entire star system. Their only hope was to reach the Hall of Echoes on Vethar Minor before the alignment completed. This was their ancestral oath place. It was a site of immense power, built by their first elders atop a natural convergence of planetary energies. It was an amplifier. There they could perform the full ancient ritual. They could renew their blood vow with the planet's own energy feeding the ceremony. This act would not just reinforce their personal bond. It would send a wave of harmonic resonance across the system. It would strengthen the veil. It would push the Watchers back into the void and seal the door behind them. The Hall of Echoes was their only hope. Their mission transformed in an instant. It was no longer about escape or finding refuge. It was a race against a clock set by the moons themselves. They had 17 days to cross dark, unpatrolled space, reach a distant world, and perform a ritual that had not been attempted in generations. The timeline was brutally short. Any delay, any mechanical failure, any navigational error would be catastrophic. Failure was not an option. It was an end. If they did not reach the hall in time, if they did not complete the ritual before the final alignment, the Watchers would cross. They would pour into reality like a flood. Their influence would spread from Vethar Minor outward, system by system. Civilizations would not fall to war. They would crumble from within, consumed by the despair and paranoia the Watchers fed upon. Worlds would go silent. Billions of lives would be extinguished not by weapons, but by an emptiness that ate the soul. The war Rennick had just survived would seem like a minor skirmish compared to the absolute annihilation that awaited. The stakes were no longer personal. They were cosmic. Every second counted. The ship they were given was an X-7 salvage pod. It sat in the far corner of the Astrahaven scrapyard like a rusted insect. Its hull was pitted with micrometeorite impacts. One of its 4 landing struts was a mismatched replacement, welded on haphazardly. A faded red condemned stamp was stenciled across the main hatch. This was not a vessel. It was a collection of failures waiting to happen. Commander Drake had provided it without comment. Its condition was his final, silent judgment on their mission. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled of oxidized metal and old coolant leaks. The life support panel flickered with red warning lights. The primary oxygen recycler was offline. The backup was running at 40% efficiency. Oxygen scarcity became their first and most immediate enemy. Rennick watched the atmospheric readouts like a hawk. The numbers dipped lower with every hour. Each breath began to feel precious. The air grew thin. Headaches started as a dull throb behind the eyes. They were slowly suffocating in the dark. Rennick tore open access panels. He traced frayed wiring with his fingers. He bypassed failed relays using spare parts cannibalized from non-essential systems. He rerouted power from the weak environmental controls to the struggling air scrubbers. It was a delicate, dangerous balance. Shunt too much power and they'd freeze. Shunt too little and they'd pass out from hypoxia. His world narrowed to gauge readings and the feel of cold metal under his hands. Every fix was temporary. A new alarm would sound within hours. A pressure valve would seize. A filter would clog. The pod was a constant negotiation with breakdown. Their course took them through unpatrolled space. These were the dark lanes, sectors left empty after the war. There were no navigation buoys here, no rescue beacons. If they drifted, no one would find them. Rennick plotted their jump by dead reckoning and star charts that were years out of date. The navigation computer was glitchy, its memory corrupted. It would sometimes display their position incorrectly for minutes at a time before correcting itself. Each jump to faster-than-light travel was a gamble. The engines rattled and groaned, threatening to shake the entire craft apart. The tension was a constant hum underneath the mechanical noises. It was the sound of impending failure. A wire could spark. A seal could rupture. A fuel line could fracture. Every creak and groan from the aging hull was a potential death sentence. They lived with the knowledge that a single, small component giving way could end them all. It created a shared, unspoken vigilance. They all listened to the ship. They learned its sounds. They knew which rattle was normal and which meant trouble, yet the cramped quarters forced them together. There was no privacy, no space to retreat. They slept in shifts in the two narrow bunks. They ate reconstituted rations from the same dispenser. The constant proximity broke down formalities. They saw each other tired, scared, and frustrated. They saw the small acts of care, Rennick sharing his water ration when the reclaimer failed, Liz using a bit of her own body heat to warm a shivering Maria during a power dip, Silra standing a silent watch over Rennick while he desperately tried to reroute a failing circuit. The failing pod became a crucible. The shared danger, the constant problem-solving under pressure forged a new kind of connection. It was no longer about a human protecting three aliens. It was about four beings depending on each other for their next breath. Trust was no longer a concept. It was the wire Rennick handed to Silra to hold steady. It was the faith that Liz would notice a change in the engine's pitch. The rusted X7 was falling apart around them, but inside its fragile shell, something new and solid was beginning to form. The salvage pod was a pressure cooker of shared dread. Every shudder of the frame, every flicker of the lights was a reminder of their fragility. Cooperation was not a choice. It was survival. They developed an unspoken rhythm. Rennick monitored the failing systems, his focus absolute. The women supported him, their unique strengths emerging not as separate skills but as parts of a new combined effort. When the oxygen alarm would blare and Rennick's hands would shake with urgency, Liz would hum. It was one of their ancient melodies, a low, steady vibration that seemed to calm the very air in the cabin. It did not fix the broken recycler, but it calmed Rennick's racing heart. It gave him the clarity to reroute another bypass to find another temporary solution. Maria began to share her visions. During the long, silent stretches between crises, she would describe the Hall of Echoes. She spoke of towering crystal spires that pulsed with a soft internal light. She described forests of singing trees and rivers that flowed with liquid light. Her words painted a picture of Vether Minor not as a mission objective, but as a home, a place of profound beauty and power that was worth saving. She made their destination feel real. She gave Rennick a reason to fight for their survival that went beyond duty or fear. Silra's stern silence evolved. She became their anchor. She did not speak often, but her presence was a constant. She would stand watch for hours, her eyes scanning the readouts alongside Rennick's. She learned the patterns of the ship's distress. She could anticipate a system failure moments before an alarm sounded. Her quiet strength was a wall against the panic that threatened to engulf them. She was their protector now, not just a protected. Even in the direst moments, small sparks of levity found a way through. A faulty seal on the emergency sanitation unit gave them the most human moment of the journey. Liz, trying to use the compact facilities, accidentally triggered the incineration cycle. A loud whoosh was followed by a startled yelp and the distinct smell of scorched. Nothing, thankfully. The unit had been empty. For a full minute, the tense silence was broken by helpless, breathless laughter. It was a ridiculous, undignified sound. It was exactly what they needed. In that moment, they were not a human and 3 aliens. They were just 4 people, trapped in a metal box, laughing at a malfunctioning toilet. That shared vulnerability did more than any conversation could. It stripped away the last layers of species barrier and military formality. Rennick stopped seeing a bonded triad and a cosmic shield. He began to see Elwes, whose humor was quick and bright. He saw Maria, who carried the memory of her world like a treasure. He saw Silra, whose loyalty was as solid as stone. They were individuals. They were a whole. The contradiction no longer troubled him. His role shifted without him noticing. He was no longer just their rescuer, the human officer fulfilling a duty. He was their partner, their companion. Their fate was his fate. Their hope was his hope. The connection was no longer about protection. It was about belonging. The rusted hull of the X-7 pod held them together, and in that forced intimacy, something quiet and essential began to grow. In the dim, recycled air of the failing ship, the trio finally told him the whole truth. The final piece of the ritual was not in their ancient texts. It was in his heart. They had told him their bond was a shield. Now they explained the cost of reforging it. The vow, shattered by the war and their near separation, could not be mended by the 3 of them alone. The ceremony required a 4th, an outsider, but not just any person. It needed someone who saw them not as a prize, not as a responsibility, but as an equal, a partner. This was not a political alliance or a military pact. It was an emotional truth. The outsider had to love them. The word hung in the thin air of the cabin. It had to be a genuine love, freely given. It could not be born of pity, duty, or obligation. It had to be a choice, a recognition of their worth as individuals and as a whole. A love that was reciprocal. They had to love him in return, not as a savior, but as a companion. This emotional resonance was the final key. It was the harmonic that would lock the renewed oath into place, making it strong enough to push back the Watchers. The Watchers, they explained, were not fooled by empty gestures or clever lies. They were creatures of pure emotion. They fed on the negative spectrum, despair, fear, hatred. But they could also sense its opposite. They could detect the unique frequency of a love that was given without condition, without ownership. If the love was not real, if it was forced or faked out of necessity, the Watchers would know instantly. The ritual would fail. The false note would be a clang of discord, a dinner bell that would summon them in force. The ceremony required perfect, vulnerable honesty. They looked at Rennick. His actions had already shown this capacity. He had defied his entire chain of command for them. He had risked his life in a dying ship. He had shared their fears and their small moments of laughter. He had seen them as people, as partners in survival. He had already begun to love them, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the quiet daily acts of care, handing over his water ration, trusting Silra to watch the consoles, laughing with Liz over a malfunctioning toilet. These were the foundations, but intention mattered. He had to consciously accept the role. He had to step into it with open eyes. It was a sacrifice, not of his life, but of his old understanding of himself. It meant letting go of the identity of the solitary logistics officer, the man who followed orders and stayed in the background. It meant embracing a connection that defied human convention, a relationship that was 1 and 3 at the same time. It meant loving across species, across culture, across the very nature of what a relationship was supposed to be. They were asking him to become the anchor for their triad, the external point that completed their circle. His love was the final component. Without it, their bond remained broken. The shield remained cracked. The ritual at the Hall of Echoes would be just a song into the void, and the Watchers would be listening. The salvage pod drifted through the silent black. The only sounds were the hum of strained life support and the beat of 4 hearts. The danger they had faced, the systems they had fixed, the air they had shared, it had all led to this quiet moment. The trio looked at Rennick. The question they had to ask hung in the space between them. It was the final piece. The one that reframed every risk he had taken, every rule he had broken. It was no longer about what he had done for them. It was about what he felt. Silra was the one who spoke. Her voice was quiet in the dim light. "You are not what I expected, Rennick Vale." She paused, her silver-tinged face serious. "I expected a soldier, a man who followed orders, a man who would take his prize and walk away." Her eyes held his. They did not look away. Now I see a man who carries 3 strangers across the dark because he cannot bear to leave anyone behind. The words were simple. They were true. They named the impulse that had driven him from the start. It was not duty. It was a deeper pull. A refusal to abandon what mattered. Then she asked the question. It was not a grand speech. It was a direct, quiet offering. Can you love us? The word was clear.
Not as a protector.
Not as an owner, but as an equal? As a partner? The question hung in the thin air. It demanded everything. It meant accepting a relationship that defied every human convention he knew. It meant embracing a bond that crossed species, culture, and the very definition of love. It was a connection that was 1 and 3 at the same time. It was a harmony, not a hierarchy. His answer would determine everything, not just their personal fate, but the success of their mission. The ritual at the Hall of Echoes required this truth. The Watchers would sense a lie. They fed on false notes. Only a love that was real, freely given, and complete could lock the renewed oath into place. His feelings were the final component. The key. Without it, the ceremony would fail. The door would remain open. The risk he had taken would be for nothing. The universe would pay the price. Rennick did not need to search for his answer. He realized it had been growing inside him for days. It was in the way he trusted Silvra's watchful silence. It was in the warmth he felt when Liz hummed her calming songs. It was in the respect he held for Maria's visions of a beautiful home. It was in the shared laugh over a broken toilet. His feelings had moved beyond the duty of a soldier. They had grown into something quieter, stronger, and more personal. He saw them, not as a bonded triad, a cosmic shield or a problem to be solved. He saw them as Silra, Liz, and Maria, and he knew. He looked at each of them in turn. He saw the hope in their eyes, mixed with the fear of his rejection. His voice was steady. There was no drama in it. Only a simple, certain truth. I think I already do too. The words were quiet, but they filled the small cabin. They were an acceptance, a promise. He was not just agreeing to a role in a ritual. He was acknowledging the bond that had already formed between them. It was the final commitment. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place. The man who could not leave anyone behind had finally found where he belonged. The damaged salvage pod shook violently as it hit Vethar Minor's atmosphere, rattling like a box of loose bolts. Rennick fought the failing controls, his knuckles white. The landing was not graceful. It was a controlled crash into a field of brittle gray grass. The ship skidded to a halt, one strut buckling with a sharp crack of metal. They were down. They had made it, but the world that greeted them was a shadow of the vibrant home Maria had described. Vethar Minor was wounded. The air carried a stale metallic taste. In the distance, forests that should have glowed with soft bioluminescence stood dull and leached of color. Their trunks were like bleached bones. The leaves were ash-gray and brittle, hanging limp in the still air. There was no hum of life, no chorus of unseen creatures. The silence was a physical weight. They followed a path toward a wide river Maria called the Sorrow's End. It was not singing. It was a sluggish, oily flow of black water that moved without sound. It smelled of rot and chemicals. Stagnant pools along its banks shimmered with a sickly iridescence. This was the Watcher's influence. It was not an active attack. It was a residue, a cancer left behind from a previous incursion, a poison that had seeped into the planet's very essence. The world was dying from the inside. Their destination rose ahead, the Hall of Echoes. It was a structure of crystalline spires, though now many were cracked or broken. Its great arches were chipped, its surfaces scarred and dulled. But it stood. Its core frame was intact, a skeleton of immense beauty waiting to be awakened. It was a monument to what this world had been, and what it could be again. It was their only hope. Above it all, the 3 moons hung in the purple sky. They were massive, their surfaces detailed and clear. They were not separate orbs. They were aligning. They moved into a perfect, terrifying line. The syzygy. The air itself seemed to warp around them. Visible distortions shimmered like heat haze, bending the light of the distant sun. The sky looked fractured like glass under stress. The alignment was thinning the veil. The door was opening. At the edges of perception, the Watchers stirred. It was not a sound or a sight. It was a pressure against the mind. A coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. A sense of being watched by something vast and hungry. Shadows seemed to twitch where no light source moved. Whispers brushed against their thoughts just below the level of hearing. They were not full here yet. They were testing the edges of the rip, waiting for the alignment to complete so they could pour through. The group moved quickly. They had reached their goal, but they were out of time. The final alignment was not a future event. It was happening now. The moon slid into their final position. The energy distortions in the air intensified, creating a low, sub-audible hum that vibrated in their teeth. They had minutes, perhaps less, before the door was fully open and the Watchers crossed over for good. They ran toward the Hall of Echoes, the fate of two species balanced on a razor's edge. The race was over. The final fight was here. The three moons locked into perfect alignment. The sky above the Hall of Echoes did not darken. It fractured. The air itself seemed to crystallize, then splinter into 1,000 shards of distorted light. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a held breath. Then they came. The Watchers descended. They were not creatures. They were shadows that moved with purpose. They had no shape, no face, no form. They were patches of absolute blackness that drank the light around them. They manifested as shifting, oily smudges against the broken sky. They were not from this reality. They were the antithesis of it. A wave of pure despair washed over the landscape. It was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the chill of hope dying. The trio did not cower. Silra, Liz, and Maria moved as one. They formed their sacred triangle. They placed Rennick at the center. He was not a singer. He was the anchor. His love for them, freely given and true, was the stable point around which their power could coalesce. They closed their eyes. They began the full song. It was not music as humans understood it. It was creation music, a sound that existed before language, a vibration that was the root of matter itself. Their voices blended into a single, impossible tone. It did not just travel through the air. It traveled through the ground, through their bodies, through the fabric of space. The song touched the Hall of Echoes. The broken crystal spires ignited. They did not just glow. They blazed with colors that had no name. Light pulsed from the ancient structure in visible concentric waves. It washed over the dead gray landscape. The brittle grass under their feet turned a deep, vibrant green. The silent black river began to shimmer. Its oily surface cleared, revealing water that flowed clean and fast. The song was not just repairing the present. It was restoring memory. It was calling the world back to what it had been. The Watchers reacted. They did not attack. They were drawn to the light. It was a paradox. Beings of pure despair, drawn to the ultimate expression of hope and harmony. They moved toward the pulsing waves of color. They did not fight it. They consumed it. Each Watcher, each shadow of despair drank the light. But this was not the emotional chaos they fed upon. This was ordered energy, harmonic truth. The light did not destroy them. It filled them. The black shifting forms began to change. They grew less solid, less defined. Their edges softened. They became translucent. Their dissolution was not an explosion. It was a quiet fading, a transformation. The despair that defined them was washed away by the light. They did not die. They unbecame. They returned to the formless potential from which they came. The rip in the sky, the tear between dimensions, began to knit itself back together. The fractured light of the aligned moon softened. The distortions in the air smoothed out. The terrible pressure on the mind lifted. The whispers of madness fell silent. The last of the Watchers faded into nothing. The final wave of light from the Hall of Echoes rolled across the land. It reached the horizon and faded. The sky was whole again. The three moons hung in a normal, peaceful configuration. The immediate screaming threat was gone. But the work was not over. The harmony they had created was not a weapon fired once. It was a new state of being. A balance restored. The song had rewritten a small piece of cosmic fate. It had mended a tear that should never have been opened. It had turned the key in a lock that had kept the universe safe for eons. The immediate danger had passed, but the echo of their song would need to hold. The silence after the song was not empty. It was a canvas. The ash-covered ground at their feet began to change. Tiny green shoots pushed through the gray soil. They did not grow slowly. They unfurled with visible purpose, their leaves a sharp, vibrant green against the dead landscape. It was an immediate physical response to the renewed harmony. Life was returning not in years or seasons, but in seconds. The black, stagnant river called Sorrow's End did not just clear. It began to sing, A low melodic hum rose from the flowing water. The oily sheen vanished, replaced by water so clear they could see colorful stones glittering on the riverbed. The sound was not the roar of a rapid. It was a gentle, continuous tone, a foundational note for the world's new song. In the distance, the forests of Vether Minor began to glow. The bioluminescence was not a faint shimmer. It was a brilliant pulsing light. Pale blues, soft greens, and deep violets ignited across the canopy. The light moved in gentle waves, synchronized with the river's song. The dead, brittle trees were gone. In their place stood a forest of living light, its glow pushing back the last of the planet's shadows. The Hall of Echoes pulsed. The ancient crystal spires were no longer scarred and dull. They shone with an internal radiance. They did not just reflect light. They created it. A steady, rhythmic pulse of gold and white light moved through the structure, a visual heartbeat. It was the rhythm of their renewed oath, made physical in the ancient stone. The hall was no longer a ruin. It was a living heart at the center of a healed world. The air itself shifted. The metallic stale taste was gone. It smelled of wet earth and clean water. The wind carried the scent of blooming flowers from the newly vibrant forests. The planet seemed to take a deep, slow breath. The tension that had gripped the very atmosphere released in a long, soft sigh. It was the relief of a being unburdened from a terrible weight. The silence of centuries was broken. It was replaced by the soft chorus of a world waking up. Their bond had accomplished more than they intended. It had not just sealed the veil against the watchers. The harmonic resonance of their vow, amplified by the Hall of Echoes and Rennick's anchoring love, had washed over the entire planet. It had healed the deep spiritual wound the watchers' previous incursion had left behind. It had cleansed the poison of despair from the soil and water. Their personal covenant had become a planetary restoration. Rennick stood amidst the rebirth. He watched the green shoots grow at his feet. He listened to the river's new song. He felt the clean air fill his lungs. He was not the man who had landed on Zarnak 9. That man was a logistics officer, a survivor who followed orders and stayed in the background. That man was gone. He had not just helped save a world. He had helped bring it back to life. He was now a part of its song, a note in its harmony. His identity was no longer defined by his service record or his species. He was defined by his connection. He was part of something ancient, something beautiful, and something far larger than himself. He was home. Their love became more than a private bond. It became the cornerstone of a new society on a healed world. They did not build a single home. They built 3. Each structure reflected the unique essence of one of the partners, a physical manifestation of their individuality within the whole. Their polyamorous family was not an anomaly. It was the foundation of a new community, a living example of harmony made real. Silra's home stood on a high cliff overlooking the singing forests. It was a structure of dark, strong wood and local stone, built to withstand the mountain winds. It did not have walls in the traditional sense. It had panels of a woven, fibrous material that whispered and sighed with every breeze, a constant, gentle music. The house felt like her, tall, unshakable, and deeply connected to the raw elements of the world. It was a place of quiet strength and enduring protection. Lys's home rested on the shore of the clear, humming river. Its walls were made of a pearlescent, reflective material that caught the light of the glowing forests and the twin moons. During the day, it shimmered with sunlight on water. At night, it pulsed with the soft blues and greens of the bioluminescent trees. The entire structure seemed to float on the boundary between light and liquid. It was a place of reflection, creativity, and gentle, luminous energy perfectly capturing her spirit. Maria's home was nestled deep within a restored crystal grove. The building was grown, not constructed. She had coaxed the living crystals to form arches and chambers, their surfaces pulsing with a soft internal golden light. The air inside was always still and warm, carrying a faint, clean scent like ozone after a rain. The gentle energy of the place soothed the mind and calmed the heart. It was a sanctuary of peace and deep, tranquil connection, a true extension of her being. Together they raised 17 children. Their family was a chorus of different ages, a blend of human and Vethi heritage, a mix of distinct energies and talents. The children learned their unique history not from books but from living it. They understood balance not as a concept, but as the rhythm of their daily lives. Their home was a living school of harmony. To maintain that balance, they followed a simple, ritualized structure for their evenings. Rennick rotated his nights between the three homes. He spent one night with Silra in her wind-whispering retreat, the next with Liz in her luminous lakeside dwelling, and the next with Maria in her tranquil crystal grove. The cycle never broke. He never favored one. He never skipped a rotation. This was not a rule of obligation. It was a practice of active love. It ensured that each relationship within the triad received equal attention, care, and energy. It prevented jealousy. It reinforced the idea that their family was a circle, not a hierarchy. Their love was the foundation, and this quiet, consistent ritual was the mortar that held the stones together, creating a civilization built on the simple, profound truth that harmony requires constant conscious care.